I was not a fan of national board certification, and so that study, that work concluded that national board certification improves either significantly or somewhat significantly student achievement in almost all cases when they did this research review. So I'd be glad to share that with you. And fortunately, very often, you have the research wars, and we could in almost every one of these topics. But this one, I think, once you look at this, hopefully that one at least puts that to rest. Some of the early studies around national board. The interesting part about national board is a completely voluntary process where people choose to go. And so if you went into a county and you identified the national board teachers, and then you got a random sample of other teachers in the county who had selected not to achieve national board, you're going to get some great teachers in that pool, because I mean right now there are 75,000 national board teachers. That represents only about 1.5% of all teachers in the country. It's not a huge pool, and so there was a lot of mixed research. Some of the more recent research that I think of as the National Academy of Science looked at teachers who achieved versus those who didn't achieve. So it really looked at what kind of apples to apples approach. And I think that there was some much more compelling data that came out of that.
So what then would be either the NEA's stance or your take on the idea of voluntary versus mandatory participation in incentive programs that are designed to increase teacher skills and knowledge? If that's something that the NEA supports, what are your thoughts on programs that are voluntary that allow some teachers to say, you know what, not interested in the skills and knowledge, happy where I am?
What we support now is the kind of active experimentation that is going on that we think must be voluntary. Again, it wouldn't have made sense in Prince George's County to bring in this very new, very experimental program and make it mandatory. But in Denver, the other thing they did in Denver, by the way, was do a 1.5-year pilot program before they implemented it, and made it voluntary for existing teachers and mandatory for new teachers. We supported that concept. We don't think ultimately it's a good idea to have dueling compensation systems. We think first and foremost it should be accessible and available to all teachers. So, for example, one of the things that we promote is if you're going to do incentives, make them school-wide incentives. And we promote. There are a lot of programs out there that say if your school succeeds, every staff member in your school deserves credit for that. It's very difficult, particularly in the elementary environment, to be able to isolate the. You can do it with the value-added research that isolates the value-additive teacher, but again, it can't measure what that teacher's guidance counselor did and what the reading specialist did and what the intervention person did. I don't know what we do with my daughter's schools in the 5th grade now, where they decided 2 years ago at elementary schools from the Teacher Incentive Fund have adopted the TAP model, which we believe is a relatively effective model. It takes in many of the elements. It does have elements of student growth, but it has student-based learning. They have a real strong focus on professional growth and professional learning, and it's a pretty good model. But in many places, when it started in Arizona, which is where it started, and all the initial research on its relatively positive effects, particularly on teacher retention and teacher satisfaction, they ran out of money in almost all of the TAP schools because more and more teachers became eligible for the incentives. One of the things, the Teacher Incentive Fund, this is a great way that policy works in D.C. because the Teacher Incentive Fund that Prince George's County is fortunate enough to have gotten a grant, again, grew out of this growing policy movement where it was the Teacher Incentive Fund. Many people believe that the Teacher Incentive Fund is part of some legislation or some policy. It's not, and it never has been. No one has ever voted on the Teacher Incentive Fund. The Teacher Incentive Fund was a $99 million discretionary grant that came out of the Department of Ed when Page and Spellings and these folks said, let's try to innovate on this and they put this $99 million there, and it's going to be continued in the current Department of Ed. They're going to continue the granting, at least of the current grantees, so that they can continue the experiment. The Teacher Incentive Fund, and you may be able to talk to this more than I can, there is a requirement in the Teacher Incentive Fund that districts demonstrate that they can sustain these programs past their
each year, a portion, so the first year, which was our planning year, we didn't have any payouts, but we have to pick up 20% of the payouts the second year, 30% the third year, and so forth until the grant is a 5-year grant.
Right.
But basically, we also have to be able to talk about where those funds are coming and how it's going to roll out across the entire school system.
I'm going to put my friends Pritchard's kind of in a spot with that, but that's going to be a big issue.
Yeah, it is. It's a very big issue. I mean,
you know, and this was 2 years ago, back when everyone thought the money was going to keep flowing. In today's economy, you know, the idea that these programs are going to be sustained, that's why, I mean, I wouldn't frankly be surprised if we, you know, just decided that this wasn't a good idea in today's economy after all. So I hope not that those things happen.
Okay, just now you kind of mentioned that the current practice or research on using students' achievement as the only indicator of student learning, it's kind of, there's a limit. So in your opinion or in NEA's opinion, what other indicators can be used to measure student performance or learning?
Good question. Good question. We have promoted the fact that, and actually have opposed the concept of using the test scores at all as a way to assess a teacher's performance or to compensate teachers. Many of our locals have decided to do that because it's the only, you know, it ends up being, you know, many of our locals have taken the approach, obviously, when you look at the economy, you look at what teacher salaries are, and you go to the table and you have opportunities to get more money in your members' pockets, then you have to do that. But many, again, there are programs that are using more authentic forms of student learning that go across the board. Again, I talk about what's going on in Denver, where you bring in, we think that context-specific ways to assess student learning are the most effective way to measure that, and we're continuing to explore ways to do that. Again, I think Denver did it well, where they look at what is going on with your group of students in your classroom. Again, one of the things that's interesting about value added is value added statistically accounts for student diversity and statistically accounts for context. But I can't tell you a middle school teacher on earth who can tell you that you can statistically account for context. And so the context of what's going on in your classroom, in your school, in your community at that time has to be taken into account. And you have to be able to measure growth. At least again, one of the promising things about value added is it is a growth, it's a growth measure. So we believe that that's the right way to go. But we think that you need to bring in, usually one of the good parts about the value added model, if we want to call it a good part, is the idea of using grades, for example, just doesn't work. You have to use authentic forms of student assessment. If you look at what's going on with the national board, Tennessee is now experimenting with systems to look at student growth. Most of them use some kind of complex teacher portfolio process where you bring in examples of student growth and student work, classroom data. Sometimes you could use as an element of that what's going on with test scores if you have that data available. But it's all kinds of other authentic student growth data that you use, that you bring in, that looks at both your practice and what's going on with your classroom and how your students are performing. So it's significantly more difficult, it's significantly more complex, but we think it's a lot more authentic at the same time.
Thank you.
I think I have a more practical question. I'm involved in research inquiry for this particular course, And I'm engaged in dialogue with maybe with at least 4 different teachers who, on the eastern